Today marks 8 months since Sudan slipped into absolute chaos. At the heart of it, a battle for supremacy between two groups who were once partners: the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan leads the SAF, and General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti, heads the RSF. The men teamed up in 2019 to overthrow longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. Burhan became a transitional military leader, and Hemeti his deputy. They were to oversee Sudan's transition to democratic rule. The power-sharing deal they signed with the civilian opposition alliance was essentially this: the military would lead for 21 months, civilian rule for 18 months, then elections. But that didn't happen. In 2021, Burhan sidelined the civilian leadership and led another coup. Gradually, his relationship with Hemeti began to sour. One point of contention was Hemeti's refusal to integrate his troops under him as previously agreed. Now, tensions came to a head on the 15th of April this year. An estimated 12,000 people have been killed in the fighting that has ensued since. That's a conservative estimate. And more than 6.5 million people have been driven from their homes. That's more than the population of Singapore. The WHO calls it the world's largest displacement crisis. Now, this is a volatile region. Sudan's neighbors, Ethiopia, Libya, Chad, nearly all of them are mired in their own internal conflicts. And major geopolitical dimensions are at play. Russia, the US, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all of them vying for influence. Now, for more, we have Clara Brackbill, Sub-Saharan Africa analyst at RAIN. Thank you very much for joining me today, Clara. Now, the war in Sudan has not captured the same kind of headlines that, say, Ukraine or Israel and Hamas have, and some have described it as the forgotten war. What are your thoughts? Why has Sudan fallen out of the spotlight?
Well, as you said, there are several other conflicts that international actors are focused on, namely the war in Israel and Gaza, in addition to the war in Ukraine. However, the trend of African conflicts, African wars falling out of the spotlight is not new, but something that's been true throughout history. And I think, we can look at several geopolitical dynamics that may underpin that, as well as historical ones.
Earlier this week, Sudan's warring generals, they agreed to a face-to-face meeting as part of efforts to establish a ceasefire, initiate political talks. How significant is this step?
Well, it's important to know that since conflict broke out on April 15th, there have been several iterations of peace talks and negotiations between the warring sides. There was news following this latest round that there was a breakthrough and that Hemeti and Burhan had agreed to a face-to-face meeting, and that was announced by mediators, including the United States. However, very quickly after that, both Burhan and Hemeti walked back those comments and said that they had not agreed to a ceasefire nor a face-to-face meeting. So the significance of the most recent round of talks has been, cold water has been thrown on that, so to speak. So going forward, the prospect for negotiations and the success of those negotiations is pretty bleak. Both leaders have said repeatedly throughout the war that they're willing to fight to the death, and another power-sharing agreement is not in the cards. Now, it's important not to take those comments at face value, but really look at the capabilities of both sides. And while the RSF has shown itself quite capable of taking and also holding territory, not only in Khartoum, but also in Darfur and other parts of the country, the SAF has also shown itself quite strong, and to some extent due to backing by foreign powers.
Speaking of capabilities, let's talk about the African Union. It was created to bring African solutions to African problems. But critics say they've retreated to the background in this situation. They're only offering sound bites. They're not taking action. Why haven't they been more involved?
Well, there's sort of a jockeying going on among mediation powers. So, as I just mentioned, the U.S., Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, they have all been involved in these talks, and so there's not a lot of oxygen in the room, and so the African Union has been sort of boxed out and sidelined in this process, and that is in large part due to the foreign interests that are involved in this conflict. So, there are allegations that the UAE is sending weapons to the paramilitary RSF. We also know that Egypt supports the SAF, the military, and so among those competing interests, there's little room for actors like the African Union to take more of a central role.
A lot of people involved. The UN, they say families in the capital are only surviving on one meager meal a day. People there could experience famine-like hunger by next summer. Let's take a listen right now to a clip from the World Food Programme.
Regular and safe humanitarian access to civilians in areas worst hit by violence has quite frankly been inadequate. WFP has been able to take advantage of momentary lulls in fighting to reach families in Greater Khartoum with food assistance, but we've only managed to reach the capital one time in the last 3 months. And only 1 in 5 people who WFP has identified as most urgently in need of food assistance in the Khartoum area has received food aid since the conflict started.
Clara, the WFP describing a very dire situation on the ground, food clearly not getting to the people who need it. How can access be improved?
Well, one of the primary ways that access can be improved is by implementing a ceasefire. And so I think that one of the main constraints to humanitarian access is the fact that there are ongoing air bombardments. So humanitarian workers aren't able to drive into Khartoum, the capital, or neighboring cities like Omdurman or Bari due to the risk of bombings. So a ceasefire is the paramount way. Another possibility is just temporary ceasefires or the establishment of humanitarian corridors. We've seen that in other wars in the region that just give a temporary pause to fighting in order for civilian populations to be reached by humanitarian workers. However, both sides have been accused by credible institutions such as the United Nations Human Rights Organization and others of carrying out abuses against civilian populations, and also on the case of the RSF of using civilian populations as human shields, which shows that there's a lack of incentive on behalf of both sides to grant those humanitarian corridors.
Yeah, you speak about the violence that's happening, and the UN has described that violence against civilians as verging on pure evil, women being the main victims. And I know some of your work has explored how gender-based violence impacts a country's political stability. Can you unpack that for us in the context of Sudan?
Certainly. So in Sudan, we know that both sides have carried out gender-based violence against women and children there. The RSF in particular has a history of using sexual assault as a weapon of war. And there's also evidence that that's occurring now in this iteration of fighting in Darfur. So we're seeing that unfold. We also know on a macro and sort of academic level, if we take a step back, that countries with higher rates of gender-based violence also experience greater difficulties with social integration and political stability. So countries that protect all civilians, regardless of gender, generally have stronger institutions, more faith in those institutions, and therefore fewer problems with stability and long-term political outlooks.
We're running out of time, but I need to ask you this one last question. One observer, at least, has said, what happens in Sudan is not going to stay in Sudan. What are the potential spillover effects of this conflict for the region, but also for the world?
Yes. So as you highlighted at the beginning of this segment, the Sudan's neighbors are already impacted by the war, and it only started in April. So we're seeing spillover violence into border areas with South Sudan. And then also there's a high percentage of refugees that are flowing from Sudan over to neighboring Chad. And so those are the two countries that I would highlight as being the most susceptible to conflict and disruptions. So in Chad, they're having their own sort of rebellion ongoing in the north, and also concerns over political stability in light of the ongoing growing anti-French sentiment there. So that sort of makes Chad more vulnerable to potential incursions by the RSF in cross-border attacks, granted that Darfur borders Chad. And then moving to South Sudan, South Sudan is expected to hold delayed elections this year, and also sort of teeters on a knife's edge in terms of its own political stability. So there are fears that with spillover violence coming from Sudan into South Sudan, the historic levers for conflict in South Sudan could be pulled, and then therefore sending South Sudan into its own new iteration of conflict with a even greater regional implication for refugee flows.
All right. Thank you so much for helping to shed light and putting the focus on the conflict in Sudan today. Clara Brackbill, Sub-Saharan Africa analyst from RAIN.